part of Carl Nielsen's Fourth Symphony, The Inextinguishable. Edward Gardner conducted the Bergen Philharmonic on that brand new Chandos release. It's coupled with Nielsen's violin concerto played by James Ennis. I'm James Jolly and welcome to this Gramophone podcast produced in association with Chandos, and this week I'm talking to Edward Gardner. He's principal conductor of the London Philharmonic and chief conductor of the Bergen Philharmonic. In August 2024, he will assume the music directorship of the Norwegian Opera and Ballet. His recorded catalogue for Chandos is extensive and is crowned by the 2020 release of Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes, recorded in Bergen, which was voted Gramophone's 2021 Opera Award winner and also our Recording of the Year. We started our conversation by going right back to the start of Gardner's career.
Were you a record nut as a teenager?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. Although my field was very different as a young.
Because you're doing a pianist.
Pianist and choral, because I sang in choir. So that was a big thing for me. I mean, I used to eat up the telescholars releases, for instance. So it was a different thing. I mean, I would say it was only in my late teens onwards that I really became, infatuated with orchestral music. And my school had an amazing LP library. And, that was just the time when people didn't think about LPs at all, so they were kind of all mine, and then I could really trawl through and find things.
And were you kind of just eating up repertoire, or were you taking two performances of Beethoven 7 and listening to them side by side? I mean, were you already sort of thinking about how two people can make the same piece of music sound completely different?
Yeah, definitely that. And I mean, I would say that came in my late teens or mid to late teens. And I remember the first time I had on my old Discman, I had Harnoncourt's late Mozart symphonies, and I could not believe it. I kept listening to that first movement of the 38th symphony, and just filled with complete wonder how it was so alive compared to what I'd heard before. So yeah, I think that was the period for me. And of course now it's more and more. The younger generation have this incredible opportunity and platform for listening to so many different versions of a minute of each piece. So yeah, but I would say it's late teens for me that I really started to think about that.
And who were your sort of musical heroes back then?
I mean, Simon Rattle, of course. I mean, I'm a Gloucester boy, so a lot of the first performances of pieces I heard were in Cheltenham Town Hall or Birmingham Town Hall with a CBSO. So I mean, and he was, that was when he was on TV, doing programs about music, and he was. Yeah, he was the leading light, I would say, in that period of my life.
I mean, you've made quite a lot of records for Chandos now.
Yeah.
I mean, is the actual art of making a record very different from preparing for a performance, or is it basically the same?
I think if you spoke to different companies and different people, you get totally different answers, wouldn't you? But what I fell in love with Chandos and Ralph and Brian straight away is that they want to reproduce that performance energy. That's a huge thing for them. So they're not necessarily after the absolute pristine biblical documents. They're after reproducing something of that moment, of that orchestra and performer in the space. So it's pretty similar for me, I would say. Yeah.
Because they record under studio conditions. I mean, quite unlike pretty well every other record company who tend to sort of stick together live recordings. As a conductor, I mean, is it tricky sort of building up that kind of tension and
yes.
feeling within a kind of basically a rather sterile space?
Yes, it really is. It's very, very hard, and it's something that you learn and you're helped with a lot, because when you start getting forensic in the studio, the music can die and you don't notice, and the orchestra doesn't notice either. Everyone has the same experience of just sort of burrowing down into something and not realising that the music's gone. But Brian is always, he describes it as putting a pin up me when that moment happens, and just finding the performance back in the piece. We're lucky with Chandos that we also have time. It's over a couple of days, or in Bergen it's over 3 or 4 days. For shorter days. So there's that sort of gestation overnight, and you can re-listen to things that you thought were marvellous and turned out not to be, or vice versa.
So do you treat the producer almost as a kind of audience, your audience for the day, a very informed audience member, shall we say?
Yeah, I think that's right. And on top of that, with Brian Pidgeon, I trust him as a musical colleague, and his taste is amazing. His taste for temperature of what's going on in a piece is really phenomenal, and I've learned to trust what he hears as opposed to what I'm experiencing.
If one looks at your recorded catalogue, I'm trying to wean myself off the word discography these
Yeah,
days, because I haven't
exactly,
actually played a disc in years. You have relationships with orchestras that's almost entirely in the studio. I mean, the BBC Philharmonic, I would have guessed you've done much, much more in studio than you've ever done in concert.
It's absolutely right, yeah. And I think my choices of repertoire, certainly at the beginning of my recording career, I was pretty careful. I mean, unusually for me, actually. I really thought, I'm not going to do too much mainstream repertoire. I'm not going to, I'll wait for that till I have a full relationship with an orchestra like Bergen, in a way, I'd count the BBC Symphony Orchestra and Birmingham in that same breath, because they became my musical families, and we really trusted each other with the process of performing and recording. So it was only then later on that I sort of delved into the mainstream of our world.
And with an orchestra like the BBC Symphony, who you recorded Elgar, you recorded Walton, so very much the British repertoire that they would be, absolutely, they would get the idiom. You didn't have to explain anything; they're just straight in. I mean, where do you sort of meet the orchestra? Because if you're say, I don't know, doing Szymanowski, in a way, it's almost sort of tabula rasa with, everybody involved, and you're kind of building it from nothing. You've got the score and that's it. But with an orchestra like the BBC Symphony, and you're doing an Elgar Symphony, they know it, you know it. I mean, where's the sort of meeting point?
We worked really hard on those, actually, the Elgar Symphonies, and they were really up for it. The second wasn't so well known to them, actually. They'd done a lot of firsts, I think, with Andrew Davis over the years, but the second wasn't so well known, and they appreciated the work, and they really, it was incredibly important to them to shine in those recordings. So it felt like preparation for a concert. And then the sessions were beautifully inspired by them and really collaborative. And it was a very, really positive experience. But of course, I'd started with the BBC. I mean, we did a few small things, but the big project I did first with the Symphony Orchestra was the Lutosławski cycle. And that was a gift because, it's music I love. It's music they'd had conducted by the composer, so they loved it too. I mean, everyone loves his music anyway. I mean, he was a genius. So there was a really positive energy in the start of our relationship, and actually the British repertoire came a while after that. You're right to say that about Szymanowski. So that's the tough one, and actually it's fun in a recording environment because the music is so dense and often kind of overwritten that actually to spotlight what needs to be heard is a real puzzle, and it was one I really enjoyed.
It's also music that actually works really well with the kind of sound world that Chandos like. They like that kind of rich, slightly more reverberant than a lot of companies, which is kind of, it allows the sort of perfumes of Szymanowski to sort of swirl around a bit.
Yes, it does. And actually, that's a discussion that Ralph and I have a lot, because I love the basis of their sound. I think it's really spectacular. But also, I'm often looking for a little bit more detail in things. So we during the sessions we had some very good and long chats about how to make that work. But I think the results are wonderful. There are certain composers who it can really be as enjoyable to be in the studio with their music as it is on the concert platform. And I would say both those Polish greats, for me, those were really wonderful, inspiring times.
It must also be nice, something like the Lutosławski series, to actually be given free rein to conduct pretty well an entire orchestral oeuvre of a single composer, rather than just saying, well, we kind of like you to do this symphony and maybe that concerto, but actually to do the lot. You must get a nice overview and the way the music changes and the actual idiom, the sort of core of the Lutosławski idiom.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a gift that Chandos have given me in many times. Actually, we talk about the Elgars, the Waltons, but I would say the package that, for me, I found I was really privileged, and I learned more than anything was the complete Mendelssohn in Birmingham, because that journey as a composer is quite extraordinary.
And it starts at very early and cuts off rather early, sadly.
Yes, And his world would have, I mean, well, actually, you see how much Wagner took from him. I mean, in every way. I mean, what he would have turned into. But
when you listen to his music, you just think, my God, this guy was a genius. I mean, when you listen to the music he was writing as a very young teenager, and then so you compare it with Mozart. I mean, Mendelssohn was streets. I mean, he was really a long way
right up there, isn't it? Yeah. And actually, the overtures was a lovely little sort of series of postcards of his development and his brilliance. I think, the Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, I think, is an extraordinary Sibelius level tone poem. I really, to have that imagination at that time is extraordinary. Yeah, I often think he's damned by his music being often sunny. That's the thing. He's not considered as serious as...
And also that just incredible facility he had.
Yeah.
People almost think, it was too easy for him. And somehow that is not a good thing.
True. And that's not the truth, actually, because he struggled a lot. I mean, those neurotic revisions he did of his symphonies were fascinating to delve into during the project as well. But... no, it's strange that we don't hear more Mendelssohn, isn't it, now? I mean, the world is full of Shostakovich and Mahler often, but, Mendelssohn is
Mahler has become the default. I mean, back in the day, conductors arrive at an orchestra 1 or 2 seasons in, they say, right, we're going to do our Beethoven cycle.
Yeah.
But it's Mahler now.
It is, yeah.
Which is maybe because Mahler speaks to us in a slightly different way. I mean, he feels more of our time with the neuroses and what he's describing, or how the world seems to be changing around him.
Yes, I think that's right. And there's this dangerous divide with period performance now, isn't there? That we feel like we're somehow not allowed to do a Haydn symphony, which must be fought against, because that great music is great music and can be played in so many different ways. And there's no orchestra I visit who aren't brilliantly inflected in their thoughts about how a Beethoven symphony should be performed, or Weber or Mozart. So it's we need to retain all that as well.
Because you've just finished the Schubert cycle in Birmingham. I mean, Schubert is a composer, who's sort of teetering on that, every major symphony orchestra would play Schubert, not so much the early symphonies, but as soon as the sort of period people got to grips with Schubert, it was falling in that, well, actually, should we really touch it? Should we really leave it to...
Yeah. That's right, and that's a big pity, because it really benefits. I mean, certainly think of the Unfinished or the Ninth. I mean, it benefits from a stylistic approach with the modern orchestra as much as anything. To do those pieces, and the Mendelssohn in the town hall was a gem, actually, because the sound, I mean, of course, Mendelssohn composed for that hall, but the sound of that hall for that large chamber style modern orchestra was absolutely perfect.
When you tackle something like Schubert, I mean, you are of a generation where, you grew up with period performance on one side, traditional performance on the other, and then it's sort of blended so that, as you were saying, most orchestras nowadays can play with a pretty good feel for the sort of the historically informed style. I mean, where do you, when you tackle something like Schubert, where do you sort of position it? You've got the CBSO. I mean, you can decide how big you want the orchestra to be. Do we want the full strings, or should we just trim it back? I mean, what was your approach, or does it change as the symphonies go on?
It changes a little, but it's chambery for me, for sure. I mean, in the town hall, we wouldn't fit in a full string size anyway, and slightly smaller is better. We were doing with sort of 10 first violins and 4 basses, and that felt really perfect. It felt like you could have the. It's a strange period in our musical history, isn't it? Because it is a tipping point from classicism into a more romantic language, and.
What's interesting, though, nowadays is that traditionally the repertoire that the period bands would have completely owned, all of a sudden we're seeing major symphony orchestras playing Bach Passions. I mean, the last 6 months, we've had Welzermers doing the Matthew Passion in Vienna. We've had him, performing the Cleveland Orchestra. I mean, now it seems that Bach is back. Sort of anyone can have a go at it. As you say, it's funny if it's that sort of classical period that now is the sort of grey area.
It's true, and actually, when I think it operatically, it's always been like that with opera, isn't it? That Handel can be done by anyone. I mean, and it's something about the affect, the primary colours of that repertoire that somehow make it easier. Actually, Beethoven fits into that too, but the more lyrical dreamers of the period, or the quirkiness of Haydn, those are the ones where there's sort of insecurity, and orchestras don't play much Mozart anymore. That's really clear, and it's something that people like me have to keep doing.
Your music director in Bergen, you've made a lot of recordings with them. A Norwegian orchestra, apart from Grieg, a lot of people would be hard pressed to say, name 3 other Norwegian composers. So there's a sort of general assumption, I guess, is that Scandinavian music sort of it crosses borders quite easily up there. You'd have a Norwegian orchestra playing Nielsen, or you'd have a Swedish orchestra playing, whatever. Is there a sort of a kind of, not exactly a generic sympathy for the music of the countries around?
Yeah, I think that's two-pronged, that one. So I think there really is, and there's a kinsmanship about the way people, the Nordic countries, approach each other's music. The Bergen Orchestra's natural style, which you hear in Grieg, is quite soft-edged, and you need to work on something when you go towards Nielsen, and dare I say it, sometimes Sibelius as well with them. But I think they share something in common with us in the UK, that this singular musical tradition that's not part of the major Central European canon. And I think we've always, if you think of those early Sibelius performances over in the UK, and the love of Beecham and Barbarolli for that repertoire, that I think we find something in each other's music that we really identify with. And I don't think that's just geographical. I think it's that we're not tied into one of those more mainstream, kaleidoscopic musical traditions of France, Germany, and Italy.
Because, listening to your recording of Peter Grimes, it's absolutely idiomatic. You would never, for a moment, think, well, this isn't a British orchestra, or this isn't an orchestra that isn't utterly steeped in this music.
Yeah, that's how I found it from the first rehearsal. Actually, they were completely wonderful. They got the style, and it's partly to do with it being a small coastal town where people feel very strange all winter. So I think they got the idea of the opera.
They really kind of tuned into what Peter Grimes was.
But seriously, yeah, I think they've really felt it very deeply.
And so you're doing a little trilogy, I think, of Nielsen recordings. You're basically matching a symphony to each of the concertos.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's repertoire. As you say, the first one is coming out maybe as people listen to this podcast, but we're so proud of it. And to have James Ennis playing the concerto, which is that's a piece which we performed it, I think, 4 times before we recorded it. But that's a piece that after performance really benefits from the studio environment, where you can take the risks and be free and find the quirkiness and the different characters in a way that's not so easy on the concert platform.
It's a strange work. When you talk to violinists, it's kind of a Marmite-y sort of piece.
Yeah,
they just
very
say,
much.
I've looked at it and I just don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
And others really adore the piece.
Yeah, I've had exactly those conversations as well. But James found something in it which is, I think, really remarkable. It has his idiomatic quirkiness, but it has a very deep soul, the way that James plays it. It's wonderful.
Yeah, because I was in Odense in Denmark for the Nielsen competition, so I actually sat through quite a few. In fact, I think in one afternoon I sat through 3 performances of the Nielsen violin concerto. So when I emerged the other end, I thought, well, I kind of know this piece. It takes quite a bit of time to get to grips with it, but I think the minute it does, you suddenly realise that actually it's really rather impressive piece.
Yeah, when it holds as a thing, that's the thing, isn't it? And it needs enough rehearsal time, actually. That's what first time I did it, I had barely enough. But there's a variety of language that everyone needs to find together. It's a tricky little thing, but it's a beauty.
Looking back through your Chandos catalogue, there are a phenomenal number of pieces that never set foot in the concert hall. All those concertos you did with Tasmin, for example.
Yeah.
The Karłowicz
violin
concerto, for example, which amazingly, when I talked to her, she said, well, actually recorded it before, which is fairly astounding.
That's true.
Statistic.
Yes, right to the beginning of her career, didn't she? And again, I'd say that's a piece. It's a curio in a way, and it was more about its coupling, but it's a piece which I probably wouldn't have programmed on the concert platform, but I think just to have it there and have an interesting, photographic negative to the piece it was coupled with was great for the recording.
And are there areas of the repertoire that you would love to dive into and explore on record?
I guess my relationship with recording will change because, of course, with the LPO we do live recordings, and there's a lot of streaming, and I think I'll do less bespoke in-studio recording. And I don't really know how I feel about that. That's just how it's turned out. But so I don't feel that too much, actually. I don't feel I mean, as you say, I've done a lot. I'm very proud of what we've achieved. But I think it'll be more in that performance-related recording that we talked at the start of the conversation about that will be the thing that I'll do most of, I'd say.
And I mean, for an orchestra like Bergen, which has, I mean, it has quite a substantial recorded legacy. I mean, how important is it, do you think, for an orchestra to record?
Well, I think for Bergen, it's a massive part of what they do because, you know, with this outpost on the west of Europe, on the west of Norway, and they need to get their voice out around the world, in Europe and in the States. Otherwise, it could feel very isolated. So I think it's major part of what they do. And then for the other orchestras I've worked with, I think, I mean, less so, but still a massive part of their diet, I think.
And in terms of actually sort of maintaining an orchestra's health, you know, their sort of, you know, how they sound. I mean, the one thing about the recording means that they can go home and actually listen to what they sound like, you know, as a corporate entity rather than just from their desk, you know, tucked away in the seconds or, you know, up on top or whatever. Yeah,
absolutely right. And with all the orchestras I work with, thinking of Bergen, LPO and I haven't done much studio work, but Birmingham as well, you can get 20 players in the booth when they're listening to playthroughs. I mean, they're properly invested in what it means for them and the orchestra. And there's a beautiful byproduct of doing these recordings, isn't there? That you're analysing your own work all the time. And as you say, for the health of an orchestra, it's a huge thing.
Obviously, Norway has kind of, you know, got its claws into you because you're taking on another Norwegian job at the opera.
Yeah, I love. Well, I'm married to someone who lives there, so I'm kind of based there. But that's not the reason I took the opera job. Randy Stainer, who's the artistic director of the opera, and I get on extremely well. And she really, you know, I was really excited by our conversations about what would be possible there. Yeah, I mean, in this very shaky cultural time in this country, it feels like a wonderful thing to have. I mean, it feels comparatively secure. It's a different world. You have more time. Musicians have more time. They don't like my wonderful London players. They're commuting 3 hours a day and doing 2 massive concerts a week, and you know it's a tough life here. I mean,
and is there a respect for music in the Nordic countries that seems to be on the wane here?
Yeah, there is. There's the idea that culture is of an essence, and even if you don't go to the Bergen Philharmonic or to the Oslo Opera, it's an important thing for people that it's in their city. I mean, they've managed to retain their sense of community. That's the thing, isn't it? And this idea of the civic is incredibly important, and we all benefit from that. I had conversations about this last night with the LPO, how hard that is to achieve in London. This idea that we're there for quite a transient, international, very diverse community, but somehow giving the impression that we're theirs. That's so important. And in a city with multiple orchestras, that's really hard.
Yeah. I mean, I think the landscape may change a bit because obviously we won't have quite the same number of visiting orchestras, I suspect, that we used to have.
Yeah, I think that's right, yeah. And you probably know the LPO have plans to build their own building with a performance space there as well, so we can feel that we're rooted somewhere in London and become properly part of a community rather than, as well as a resident orchestra at the South Bank.
Of course, Glyndebourne.
Yeah, well, Glyndebourne.
And presumably that must be very good for an orchestra's health as well, playing opera.
Yeah, I mean the best orchestras in the world are the ones that do both, aren't they? Because they retain that flexibility. The massive differential in repertoire. I mean, I think that's more in opera, isn't it, than you would say symphonically. I mean, you do have to play Così and you do have to play Wozzeck.
Yeah. Well, it's like when people criticise the Vienna Philharmonic and say, "Oh, yeah, but their repertoire is so narrow," and you're thinking, "Well, hang on."
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
yeah.
when they're not on the concert platform, they're playing everything in the opera house from really brand spanking new stuff right back.
Absolutely right, yeah. And you feel that with the LPO. They're so flexible and they're gorgeous accompanists. And
I was going to say they listen in a way that
they do. Yeah, and it turns. I mean, that quality of chamber music that they have, I think, is very strong, and that's a joy to be part of as a conductor. Yeah, it gives them relief from this intensive concert series as a season as well, of course, which I think for their health is incredibly important.
Because it must be quite nice getting into a rhythm if you're getting on the train, you go down to Glyndebourne and you do the same piece for 15 performances.
Yeah.
Then it must, not you don't quite get into the sort of routine that if you're kind of like playing in the pits of Cats for 20 years.
True, no.
But
it's
must
a different
be nice
thing,
to play, knowing, actually we've got a nice performance, we know where we are, things will change on the night, but basically
exactly.
When you're in a groove.
Yeah, they love it, and they find it a jolt to come back to that intensive concert experience of 3 days and incredible pressure for sure. But but they managed to do both.
I just get the feeling at the moment going to concerts, and I don't know whether it's just because we were starved of music for those strange couple of years, but I just feel that orchestras are playing so well at the moment. There's a sort of intensity that really takes the breath away.
I feel exactly the same thing, and orchestras feel there's a gratitude in the room. There's a not taking what we had for granted. There's been a real shift in that, but I find it in audiences as well. And there may be a generation who are slower to come back, but we're finding already this year there's a good uplift in how people relate to our concerts, and the reaction is much more overt than it used to be. It's a beautiful thing.
I get the sense of just sitting in an audience that people are listening in a way that they perhaps didn't listen before. There's a sort of hunger.
Yeah, a hunger, exactly. It was so nice coming back to the LPO straight after. Well, there was one more lockdown, I think, afterwards, or there was certainly one more outbreak. But coming back with Midsummer Marriage, this strange piece, and that was just at the end of that lockdown, and it was amazing. It felt like a sort of communion between us and the audience.
And do you feel, in Bergen, it's a single orchestra in, as you say, a sort of city that's sort of stuck out on its own. Do you feel almost a kind of civic role there as the boss of the orchestra in a way that perhaps you don't in London because there are so many orchestras and so many conductors?
Yeah, very much. I think it's and they know who the orchestra are. I was checking in and I had a problem with my baggage. I can't remember if it was too heavy or the wrong shape or something. And then I was having this argument with someone at the desk, and this handler came over and said, "No, don't worry, I'll take it. I'll sort it out." By the way, loved the Schoenberg last week. Do you think that would not happen in London in any way? But it's it's a beautiful thing.
One of the sea interludes from Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes. My guest, Edward Gardner, conducted the Bergen Philharmonic on that Gramophone Award-winning Chandos recording. Gramophone podcasts are free, but if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone magazine. Over 13 issues a year, we bring you hundreds of reviews by our expert critics, as well as in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases and the most exciting musicians of the day. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support, and consider leaving a review or rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And do look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.